Okay, so welcome everyone. Good to be together again. Welcome back to the sixth session of Halakhah for the Ages, reading Responsa from a Bygone era with Dr. Rachel Furst. Just a reminder, if you're receiving an invitation to be a panelist, that would allow you to participate verbally during class. You would have the option to show us your face, keep your video on or off. And just please stay muted when you're not actively speaking. I will help mute as necessary. And just remember to unmute so we can hear when you speak. If you're with us here on Zoom, you can also write on the chat, or if you're watching us live on Facebook, you can also make a comment there and I will read it to Rachel. And with that, I'll turn it to you, Rachel.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks as always for the introduction, and thank you to all who are rejoining us or joining us anew. We have been, over the course of the past several weeks, looking at a series of responsa that were written by scholars, the scholars of medieval Ashkenaz, and we've spoken about that geographic location and some of the figures involved. Just a quick recap for those who were with us last week or for those who were not. Last week, we took a look at a series of responsa that dealt with a Halakhic phenomenon that, in fact, was unique to medieval Ashkenaz insofar as it actually originated outside of the Halakhic sphere, and that was a specific method of securing loans. And one of the interesting things that I wanted to highlight last week was the way in which some of the Halakhic authorities, these Halakhic respondents, navigated the ways in which they were going to adjudicate cases of, using cases in which this legal instrument was used, given the fact that there really was no Halakhic precedent for using this particular type of legal instrument. And we saw the ways in which they contended with that and kind of took it into the Halakhic playing field, despite the fact that they were very straightforward about its origin outside of the Halakhic realm. So that was the focus on a particular practice pertaining to the securing of loans, so a particular financial practice. 2 weeks ago, we took a look at a phenomenon concerning light rights and air rights between neighbors that also involved a very straightforward and explicit recognition on the part of these Halakhic authorities that some of the legal, in that case, it was legal documents and other legal instruments that were being used by Jews, particularly when they were acquiring or purchasing property that had originated with Christian neighbors, these were legal instruments, legal documents that were not Halakhic, that were explicitly either Latin or German, and certainly did not originate in the Halakhic system. Nonetheless, as we saw, the Halakhic authorities contended with them and were willing to accept them into the Halakhic discourse, the discourse of these Batei Din, these Jewish courts. And I speculated a little bit as to why the Halakhic authorities that we've been looking at might have been willing to do this. Why might they have been willing to accept as evidence in a Jewish court documents that originated elsewhere, or to contend in a Halakhic context with these kinds of, again, legal instruments that were clearly not originally from the Halakhic field? And one of the suggestions that I offered is that medieval Halakhic authorities, like really Halakhic authorities basically throughout the ages, were very adamant that Jews should be adjudicating their disputes in Jewish courts, right? And I spoke a little bit both last week and the week before about the jurisdiction of the Jewish courts, about the privileges that granted them, the privileges granted to the Jewish communities of the medieval German Empire by local authorities that gave them the rights to adjudicate cases between two Jews, rights which they very fiercely held and very fiercely contested. And that perhaps part of the reason that these halachic authorities were willing to, again, sort of welcome into the Jewish courtroom legal instruments that originated elsewhere was that they saw it as a means of keeping the Jews, at the very least, in the Jewish courts. And I mentioned, by the way, that it is very clear from some of the halachic material that we have that not all Jews conformed to that expectation and desire on the part of the rabbinic authorities, that there were definitely throughout Jewish history, but for our purposes, specifically in this historical context that we are examining, there were certainly Jews who chose to adjudicate their legal disputes with fellow Jews in local non-Jewish courts. What we're going to be looking at today, the case study that we're going to be focusing on in our class today, actually a murder case. So we're moving back from civil law back into the realm. I shouldn't say back. We're moving into the realm of what certainly today we would consider to be criminal law, although that distinction was not quite as clear in the medieval period. We're going to be looking at a case in which the Jewish authorities involved, I want to say actually not only permit, but perhaps even go so far as to encourage Jews to turn, again, under very specific circumstances, to local non-halachic, non-Jewish courts, non-Jewish systems of law as a means of contending with this kind of violence. And one of the big questions that we're going to be asking ourselves is under what circumstances this was so, and how distinctive and how unique were the halachic arguments offered in that regard. Everyone should have received the handout, and if not, I believe Evie has posted it in the chat, so you can take a look at it along with me. I'm going to share my screen momentarily, but before I do so, I just want to mention that the respondent we're going to be focusing on today is Rabbi Chaim ben Isaac Or Zavra, and you can see that if you scroll down to the bottom of the responsa that I provided as today's text, you'll see his name highlighted, and you can also see right up at the top of the source sheet that this is actually taken from his collection of responsa. But before we get to the text itself, I do want to just share first my PowerPoint screen, so please bear with me for just a moment. Because I'd like to take a look together at a map, a timeline, and just so that you get a sense of the physical context of these texts that we're looking at, a picture of the really rather strikingly organized and beautiful manuscript that this responsa derives from. So as we're going to see in just a little while, the reason I'm doing this now is just so that we don't have to keep switching back and forth between the screens. But I do want to sort of point out at the outset that the case we're going to be looking at today, although it is not explicitly located in any distinctive town or any distinctive region by the author of the responsum itself, I'm going to argue, and you'll let me know by the end whether you agree with me, that it took place in the environs of the city Magdeburg, which I circled for you here on the map. As you can see just by glancing at it, the cases that we've been talking about thus far, some of the ones that were explicitly located, were in the area, the Rhine region, which is kind of a cradle of Jewish community life in medieval Ashkenaz. Here today, we're going to be talking about a case that, again, at least I'm going to argue, took place at what was really sort of the periphery of Jewish settlement in medieval Germany, although Magdeburg was already a well-established town in its own right, as well as a fairly well-established Jewish community by the point in time that this incident took place. But you can see that it's in the northeastern regions of the medieval German Empire. It's certainly a sort of peripheral area as far as Jewish communal life during this era was concerned. And just to, again, kind of place us chronologically, again, I want to point to the Rabbi Meir ben Baruch of Rothenburg, who is not the respondent that we're going to be dealing with today, but it's our touchstone. As you can see here, again, as we've discussed several times, Rabbi Meir was a very important, probably the most prominent Halakhic authority during the second half of the 13th century in Germany or Ashkenaz. Last week, we saw a responsa of his, as well as a responsum of his student, Rabbi Asher ben Yechiel. Today, we're going to be, as I said, looking at a responsum by a different one of his students, Chaim ben Isaac or Zerua, who is not here on the timeline, but who, again, rose to prominence, much like Asher and some of Meir's other students, rose to prominence as a halachic authority, probably in the wake of Meir's first imprisonment and then death in captivity. His imprisonment was in 1286 and his death was in 1293. So the case that we're talking about probably occurred, we don't have a precise dating, but it probably occurred in the very last years of the 13th century, or perhaps even the very early years of the 14th century. We don't have a precise date of Chaim's death, but he probably died sometime at the beginning, sometime in the first 2 decades of the 14th century. So sometime around 1310, 1315, or the likes. I promised you a picture of the manuscript. This manuscript that you see in front of you, this is the text that you see in front of you is part of the text that we're going to be reading today. This is in fact a 14th century copy of Chaim or Zeruah's Responsa. This is a collection. When we're talking about medieval Responsa collections, we don't always know exactly who put them together. They may have originated in collections that the respondent, the primary respondent himself, kept of, copies of the Responsa that he sent to others, copies of some of the correspondence that he received, as well as copies of some earlier, older Responsa of his teachers, of his predecessors, that he liked to have on hand as precedent, which oftentimes got woven into the collections. So, for example, in this collection that is, again, it's called the Responsa of Chaim or Zeruah, the majority of the writing in this collection was done by Chaim himself, but there are also quite a number of pieces that were written by either his contemporaries or even by his teachers and earlier predecessors that he, again, must have had, in his workroom, in his workspace, and considered to be part of the collection that he wanted to have at his fingertips. In any event, this is certainly not what we call a manuscript, what we call an autograph manuscript. In other words, this is not Chaim's own writing. This is a scribal copy of Chaim's writing. And it's actually quite, as I said, it's not beautiful in the way of being illustrated. It's not an illuminated manuscript, but it is very clean and neat and clear writing. You can see some in the margins. There are a couple of corrections that always happens when copyists work. This is not paper. This is obviously not a print edition. This is a handwritten copy on parchment. It's quite a fairly large book physically. And actually, one thing that's very striking about this manuscript copy of Chaim's Responsa is the clean margins. In many medieval texts that have survived, the margins are filled with comments or commentary, or even texts that have nothing to do with the primary text, simply because parchment was very expensive, and people tried to use every extra inch. I don't have a good explanation as to why this particular manuscript remained so clean with such wide margins. One thing that I will note, though, is that this is the only medieval copy of Chaim's writings that has survived. We don't have any other medieval manuscripts at all of Chaim or Zarua's Responsa. It was lost for quite some time, for quite some centuries, and resurfaced in the 19th century. So it's possible that it's somehow sort of passed out of circulation for a while. Chaim's Responsa were known and were quoted in other sources, but the original text, again, simply did not survive. And there's all kinds of reasons that I won't go into now as to why the survival rate of medieval Ashkenazi writings was, in some cases, fairly low. In any event, thankfully, we do have this manuscript today. Okay, I'm going to now, without further ado, I'd like to take a look together at the text itself. And what we're going to do today, bear with me for 1 second, and I'm going to get up the text that I'd like to take a look at. And this is the text that you should have in front of you as well, if you'd like it. Okay, here we go. This responsa, excuse me, as a number of the ones that we've seen in previous weeks, does not preserve the original question that was posed to Chaim, right? Chaim here is functioning as Meir did in the various examples that we saw, as Asher did in the case that we saw last week. He's functioning as an outside authority who was consulted by, we're going to see, was consulted by local judges who were adjudicating a case that they weren't quite sure how to contend with. This one, again, it doesn't preserve the original correspondence. It only preserves Chaim's response to that correspondence. And so the first thing that I'd like us to do as a sort of methodological exercise today is to see if we can piece together the story, right? What exactly was the case that Chaim was contending with? And that's oftentimes a challenge that we have in working with these kinds of texts, to figure out what was the case, what was the halachic question that was posed to the respondent. You can see, even just by glancing at the file I sent, that this is a fairly long responsum. And so the bits and pieces of the story, we're going to jump around a little bit, are kind of woven in throughout Chaim's halachic discussion. And again, as I said beforehand, some pieces of information are going to remain gaps. They're going to remain question marks. There's a lot of things that we're going to have to concede that we do not understand or do not know about the case, given that we only have this particular piece of correspondence. But let's get started and see what we can figure out together. Okay, so Chaim opens his responsum here, addressing, as we're about to see, one of the litigants, or one of the groups of litigants that are part of the story. Will you quarrel forever? He begins. And multiply altercations, relatives of Reb Shalom, the murdered one, and their opponents. Right, so we get the sense, right? It's clear to us right from the outset that we're dealing with a murder case here. Now, I'm sorry that I keep interrupting myself, but I do want to add one more word of preface that I realize is important. We have discussed in previous weeks that the Jewish courts in medieval Ashkenaz did not, generally speaking, have jurisdiction over murder cases. They did not have jurisdiction over high crimes. Nonetheless, this is a good example of how sometimes those high crimes did come to Jewish courts, did make their way to Jewish courts. But as we're going to see, they made their way in a sort of roundabout fashion. And that's another point that I want you to keep in mind as we try to piece together this story. Okay, so will you quarrel, forever and multiply altercations, relatives of Reb Shalom, the murdered one, and their opponents. Right, kind of ironic that the murdered one who is involved with this altercation was called Shalom, right? But here is another example of where, here in this particular case, I think we probably are talking about an original name rather than a stock name like Reuben or Simeon. And are there not in your midst, praise the Lord, blessed is God, learned and wise men? For example, my teacher Rabbi Shabtai, son of the Honorable Rabbi Shmuel, in his court. And you should have acted in accordance with their instructions and thus suppressed the dispute. And what benefit is there to the relatives of the murdered one, even if they could manage to defame Reb Moshe and his father-in-law? Will they bring Reb Shalom back to life thereby? Even though he, that is Shalom, began to draw his knife, and his brothers and brothers-in-law drew swords until they drove respectable people from the feast in dispute and altercation, like the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa from Tractate Gittin, and the altercation intensified until blood was shed. If at that point they, that is Moshe and his father-in-law, would have complained to the non-Jews, I would not have held them accountable for whatever loss Reb Shalom and his brothers and brothers-in-law would have incurred thereby. For it is like a person who is about to strike his fellow. The victim will not restrain himself with regard to his body, that is his life, and certainly not with regards to his money, as wrote my teacher, Rabbi Meir. This is the famous Rabbi Meir of Wittenberg. May the righteous and holy one merit eternal life. Okay, let's pause right over here. We've obviously only just started tackling this, but let me ask you, what, if anything, in the way of narrative, in the way of case, did you understand from this paragraph? Do you have any sense of what kind of case has made its way to Rabbi Chaim or Zarua? What kind of question, what kind of altercation is he being asked to respond to? Okay, it's a little challenging here to try but see if you can fish out any facts.
Monique, did you want to speak?
I can try.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Rachel.
Yeah, please.
Am I mute? No.
You're good.
Oh, okay. So there was a fight and someone was murdered, and then the relatives perhaps of the murdered one brought it to court, claiming that X and Y might have done it, and they want X and Y to be held liable. And also probably that other people there should have done something.
Okay, so that's a good start. Let me just ask you, do you have a sense of who, just so that we can keep all the pieces straight, who are the different characters? Who are the different sides or the different litigants in this dispute?
Rabbi Moshe and his father-in-law would be the
Moshe and his father-in-law, who were they?
Either they killed or they failed to prevent the killing.
Okay, so they are, so in other words, we have on one side Moshe and his father-in-law, right? And who's on the other side of this dispute?
Well, Rabbi Shalom is the one who died.
Yeah, Reb Shalom is the murdered one. And who else gets mentioned there?
Brothers and brothers-in-law.
Brothers and brothers-in-law, right? So there's the murdered victim, who's obviously no longer, with us, no longer in court, does not make his way to court, but presumably his relatives, right, would have been. Now, again, we're going to see that this altercation has many stages to it, but in this opening sort of scene, I think we can say that if we have defendants and plaintiffs here, right? The plaintiffs are probably the relatives of this murdered Reb Shalom, and Reb Moshe and his father-in-law are the defendants. Now, as you pointed out, it's not entirely clear. Like, are they actually being accused of the murder, or are they, as you suggested, maybe being accused of some kind of, being some kind of accomplices to the murder, right? Or at the very least, not having prevented the murder. Right? Now, let me ask you a question. The respondent here mentions the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. Is that familiar to anyone? The story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa makes its appearance, again, as it says here in the middle of Tractate Gittin, in the context of a series of midrashim about the destruction of the temple. Right? It's a reference to a kind of famous story that is told about in the Talmud about why the temple may have been destroyed. It's a story about a feast that was held by a certain rich Jerusalemite who intended to invite a guest by the name of Kamsa, but another man was inadvertently invited, whose name was Bar Kamsa, and this rich host, threw him out of the meal, and really humiliated him in front of all the other guests, saying he was not invited to the party. And the rabbis who were guests at this party as well sat by silently and did nothing to prevent this humiliation. Right, that's the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa that is referenced here. That kind of, in a way, that reference ups the stakes here, right? This, again, the Kamsa and Bar Kamsa story is offered by the Talmud as one of the causes of the destruction of the temple, right? The temple was destroyed. The second temple was presumably destroyed because of sinat chinam, or baseless hatred between people. And so I think that the mention of it here gives you a little bit of the sense that Chaim is inserting right at the outset here of the moral stakes of this particular story. Let me ask you, did anybody else gather any other details that might help us untangle what exactly the situation is here, what exactly the scenario that we're contending with is? What did, again, we said Moshe and his father-in-law were the defendants. They're being accused of, again, either murder or accomplice to murder. And the relatives of Shalom are the ones who are the plaintiffs here. Where did the relatives of Shalom bring the defendants?
Can you repeat the question?
Where do you think they brought the defendants? What kinds of court did they bring the defendants to? They must have brought the defendants to a Jewish court, let's assume right now, right? Yeah. And apparently part of what they were trying to do was, they were accusing Moshe and his father-in-law of, again, murder, accomplice to murder, and trying to defame them, by getting them branded as murderers or accomplices to murder. Chaim's opening line critique here is, what do you intend to accomplish with this lawsuit? Right? Are you going to bring your murdered relative Shalom to life by defaming your opponents? Right? What are you trying to accomplish? What does he suggest that they should have done? Right? And again, we also understand, by the way, that there was some kind of fight at a party, right? That's also, we understand that from the Kamsa and Bar Kamsa reference, but also because he narrates here, right, that they began to draw their knives, and the brothers, and it was Shalom, the murdered one, who began to draw his knife, right? So he was definitely implicated in the violence. He started drawing his knife. His brothers and brothers-in-law started drawing their swords. Respectable people left the scene of whatever, wherever this altercation was taking place, and ultimately blood was shed. Right? It's not exactly clear what happened next, but ultimately blood was shed. Now, what does Chaim, and this is an important point for our purposes tonight, what does Chaim suggest would have been the appropriate response at that by all of the people involved in this violence at that point, right? When violence broke out, when people started drawing knives and swords, what should the bystanders have done, or the people involved in this what should they have done according to Chaim? Just based on what we read.
Address the gun to the non-Jews, to take to the non-Jewish.
Yeah, let's read. Yes, exactly. Let's read that line again, right? He says the altercation, I'm right in the middle of the paragraph. The altercation intensified until blood was shed. Exactly. Thank you. Go ahead. If at that point,
that is, Moshe and his father-in-law would have complained to the non-Jews, that is, the authorities, I would not have held them accountable for whatever loss Rabbi Shalom and his brothers and brothers-in-law would have incurred thereby.
Okay, so obviously, meaning we're talking about if they had taken Shalom to a local non-Jewish court before murdering him, right, before the ultimate bloodshed took place, Chaim says, I would not have held them accountable for whatever loss Shalom and his relatives might have incurred. Now, what loss do you think he's talking about there? What do you understand from that? What loss might they have incurred in a non-Jewish court?
They might have been fined.
Okay, very good. In other words, presumably if Moshe and his father-in-law would have dragged these violent men into a local non-Jewish court, presumably the local non-Jewish court would have fined them perhaps or imposed some kind of punishment and sanctions on them. In other words, they would have, caused them some kind of loss or punishment. Now, as we've discussed in the past, the general halachic rule was you're not allowed to take your fellow into a local or into a non-Jewish court. And one of the reasons you're not allowed to take your fellow into a non-Jewish court is because the understanding was that whatever the non-Jewish court might have ruled, right, if it was imposing fines or imposing punishments, those were not halachically recognized or sanctioned punishments. And therefore, the fellow Jew who dragged them into that legal situation would be held responsible for, for having caused them this loss, which was not considered halachically warranted. What Chaim is saying right here at the outset is that if they, at that point, if Moshe and his father-in-law, right, the people who were being threatened would have taken these violent men into a local non-Jewish authority, court, we would not have held them responsible. Or I, at least he says, if you were asking me, would not have held them responsible. In other words, I would have considered that to be a positive and appropriate step, a positive and appropriate action. Again, now this is all against the backdrop of a blanket prohibition that the medieval authorities, along with halachic authorities throughout the ages, embraced, prohibiting Jews from going to local non-Jewish justice. Why do you think, right, in the face of that, right, what Chaim is saying here is kind of radical. Why do you think Chaim is suggesting that that would have been the appropriate action? That's not what happened, right? Instead, violence was committed. But why do you think he's suggesting that the appropriate action would have been to go to a local non-Jewish authority or court?
So first, I might point out that it seems more plausible, especially in line with his later analysis, that calling the police might have been the more appropriate, might have been the intended action, because, and that would fit his explanation that the reason it was appropriate to appeal to the authorities in this case is that it's a matter of self-defense or protecting the life of a third party, which is explicitly allowed, and therefore would override the prohibition of going to the non-Jewish authorities, whereas going to a court would be only an after-the-fact action.
Okay, so thank you for pointing that out. Now I mean, that all makes sense in the context of our contemporary understanding of the way that that law enforcement versus the justice system work and are set up. It didn't quite work that way in medieval Europe, right? There wasn't really a police force in the sense, that is a designated law enforcement body in the same way that we conceive of today. And so that when they're talking about the authorities, yeah, it's what the part that I definitely agree with is that it's very clear that what he's suggesting is that it would have been appropriate to stop the violence in its tracks, right? To stop the cycle of violence by turning to some kind of local body, some kind of local individuals who would have been able to break the cycle, to stop the violence right there. Again, I don't think we can think of police force in the sense that we envision it today. And that's why I said it's more likely that what they were talking about are some kind of, again, it was the judicial bodies and the law enforcement bodies were very intertwined at that point, at that particular point in time. But yes, I agree. It definitely seems to me that his point is that for the sake of stopping violence, that would have been appropriate. Now, it's interesting that he does not say they should have turned to the local Jewish authorities. Right? He doesn't say, why didn't you turn to the local Jewish authorities instead of, killing somebody, instead of, pursuing this kind of vigilante justice or just letting the violence escalate. And whether that indicates that there was a vacuum in the Jewish, again, law enforcement / justice system, or whether it indicates that Chaim, along with his interlocutors, understood that the Jewish authorities would not have had the teeth to actually be effective in this particular case. Either way, that seems to be something like that seems to be the implications here. And that's an important part of this picture as well. And that, by the way, is something that is not unique to this particular case, but something that we do hear about over and over again. Kind of the impotence of the Jewish courts and the Jewish authorities, particularly in the face of violent altercations. Okay, let's continue a little bit because we have only, again, sort of some parts of the picture thus far. I want to skip over the next paragraph, and I'd like to pick where he gets into a sort of a legal discussion that I want to put on the side for the moment. I want to pick up with this first complete paragraph on page 2, the one that in the English begins with "and similarly." He says, "And similarly, I assert that this is the reason that our rabbis excused one who complains to the authorities during his hour of rage." And the Hebrew term, the Halakhic term here is sha'at haza'am, hour of rage, because his rage overpowers him and he cannot restrain himself due to his pain and shame, such that even if he does not complain and take revenge via the non-Jewish judge, he will avenge his shame even at the expense of his life. And lest he thereby come to shed blood, it is permissible to complain to the non-Jewish judge. Right, and here again, I want to point out here, and I think this is in response to what was just suggested, the Hebrew here is shofet. It's very clear that we're talking about a judge here, not police or something like that. It's permissible to complain to the non-Jewish judge, and it is permissible even for others to do so, as I explained previously. Okay, so let's pause right over here. Right now, Chaim is trying to give a somewhat broader halachic context for his ruling, for his statement, for his claims. Right? He says, I was just talking about your particular altercation and what I think you should have done in the moment, but this is in fact my motivation is the same as the reasoning for which our rabbis Rabotenu created this halachic category of someone who is bish'at hazam, right? A person who is in the midst of an hour of rage, right? That person, on a sort of broader halachic level, has been granted, that category of person, of course, has been granted an exemption by the rabbis. An exemption from what? Did you understand that? That person, right, again, we're still talking about the general prohibition to take a fellow Jew to a non-Jewish court, right? Despite that rule, a person who drags his fellow Jew to a non-Jewish court in his sha'at hazam, or hour of rage, is exempted from the normal consequences, from the normal punitive measures that the halakhah would impose upon him for doing that, for going to a non-Jewish court. Why? What's the explanation, the general halachic explanation for that concept? Because his rage overpowers him and he cannot restrain himself due to his pain and shame. Right, so just to explain, to make this concept a little bit clearer, there seems to have been a halachic category in medieval Ashkenaz, right? This concept of sha'at hazam is something that also seems to be rather unique to the medieval Ashkenazi sphere, where the rabbis created this category that excused a person who was really like in the heat of anger, a person who had just been beaten, or a person who had just been subject to a severe insult, who was so caught up in his emotional response that it would have been natural, in a sense, for him to respond to his, again, attacker, or to his to the one who insulted him by striking back. In that case, in that context, the rabbis said, better that he submit to local justice, which we normally prohibit, than that he responds in accordance with his emotions. Right, and again, Chaim is arguing here explicitly that that's the basic halachic framework. That's the concept that he's trying to apply to the case at hand. And by the way, we do have a fair amount of evidence for the use of this concept by other rabbinic authorities in medieval Ashkenaz, but it was not by any means universally accepted. And as a matter of fact, Chaim's teacher, Mayor of Rothenburg, was very resistant to this concept, was very resistant to the idea that there had been any kind of general halachic consensus that a person who is caught up in his hour of rage, again, in the midst of an attack or in the midst of an emotional response to an attack, that person is, again, exempted from the normal prohibition to go to a non-Jewish authority. Mayor rejected that. Mayor said there is no such concept. I'm not familiar with any kind of community enactment or any kinds of halachic ruling of that matter. But Chaim seems here very clearly to embrace the concept, and Chaim, again, has, there's other precedent for medieval Ashkenazi scholars doing so as well. I want to continue a little bit with the next paragraph to try and piece together a little bit more of the story here so that we can then really begin to unpack it. Chaim says, and in any case, do you see where I am? The beginning of the next paragraph. And in any case, in this terrible episode, if after he, that is Shalom, the man who ultimately got murdered, shamed them and drove them from the feast, and they, that is Moshe and his father-in-law, departed the said group, if they would have complained to the non-Jewish authorities and thereby resolved not to take further revenge, it would seem right to absolve them of responsibility for any damages they would have caused their shamers thereby, right? So I think what we can understand here is that what Chaim thinks should have happened, is that when Shalom began, again, drawing swords and knives and started threatening or started humiliating somehow Moshe and his father-in-law, what Moshe and his father-in-law should have done, again, just to underscore it, is to leave the group, leave the party, leave the situation, and go straight to the non-Jewish authorities to report this, right? And they would have been resolved, right? And that would have stopped the cycle of violence, stopped the cycle of revenge. We would have absolved them of responsibility for any damages they might have caused to Shalom and his relatives when they got to the non-Jewish court, right? Instead, what actually happened? In fact, according to all the testimonies, the non-Jews came to kill or to menace. But regardless, the one who is known to have brought the non-Jews and to have drawn the half length of his sword and ushered them into the home of the murdered one, he is an outright murderer. Okay, and now we hear another twist to this case. This is a sort of an added complication. I don't know if any of you were able to follow that. Chaim now reveals another facet to what actually happened, right? Moshe and his father-in-law, unfortunately, as far as Chaim is concerned, did not go to the non-Jewish authorities. Instead, what did they do? Right, again, they were threatened by Shalom and his relatives. How did they respond? Inappropriately, according to Chaim. It sounds like what they did is hire or somehow contract some kind of thug, a Jewish man, right? A Jewish man who was known for his, thuggery, let's say. They seem to have hired him to go and attack Shalom, right? To pay back this insult or to pay back this violence and threat to which Moshe and his father-in-law were subjected by going to visit Shalom in his home and, roughing him up. That seems to have been what happened, right? And that man, again, I'm piecing together a lot of different things that you can see, some of which you can see here and some of which we'll see later. That Jewish man seems to have taken with him when he went to, go into Shalom's home and rough him up, seems to have taken with him non-Jews. And the non-Jews were the hitmen. They were the one who ultimately murdered Shalom. And the question is, okay, again, first of all, how do we deal with Moshe and his father-in-law who contracted these guys? And how do we deal with, in particular, the Jewish thug who hired these non-Jewish, let's call them assassins, because ultimately they did murder Moshe, murder Shalom, excuse me, although it's not clear that that was in fact their intention. Right, so now we have another complicated aspect to the story here. We have a number of different characters and layers here, right? And what Chaim says over here, let's just keep reading for one moment. Right, he says, this Jewish man who is known to have brought the non-Jews and to have drawn the half length of his sword and ushered them, these non-Jewish assassins, into the home of the murdered one, he is an outright murderer. Right, now, this is an important point because that Jewish thug was apparently not the one who actually killed Shalom. Right, it was the non-Jewish assassins that he brought along who killed Shalom. But nonetheless, Chaim says that Jewish man is an outright murderer. He bears full responsibility for the murder itself. And indeed, he should be denounced in all the communities that know him. Let his stench and shame rise, quote from Yoel, and may he be trapped in his own net. However, Rabbi Moshe and his father-in-law, why should they be trapped? Right? So again, I realize this is a complicated case to cover in a short amount of time, but let me try to make a little bit of sense of this for you. Right? Now we're back to Moshe and his father-in-law, who were the ones who contracted with the Jewish thug who brought along his non-Jewish assassins, which is how Shalom got killed. What is their relationship to the murder? Right? And that's really the case that Chaim apparently has been asked to adjudicate. How do we deal with Moshe and his father-in-law who set this chain of violent actions into motion, right? Who took revenge by contracting a Jewish thug, who then brought along his non-Jewish assassins, which all resulted in another Jew being killed. How do we deal with Moshe and his father-in-law? So what Chaim seems to be saying here is that they are not considered murderers, right? Not that their hands are clean, but they are not considered murderers. Why are they not to be trapped, right? They are not considered murderers, even if it were so that they told the villain to bring the non-Jews, right? Even if they actually told that Jewish thug, bring along your assassins and go get Shalom, which apparently was not clear. But even if that were the case, does one listen to the words of the master or the words of the student? In other words, right, when we're talking about two Jews and one Jew tells another Jew to commit a crime, in this case, to murder, who is held responsible? Ultimately, it's the one who does the action, not the one who gives the instructions. And this is based on the idea that every adult Jew is responsible for his own actions, right? The words of the master, the words of the students are a reference to the words of God, the master, do not kill, versus the words of the student or the lower one, meaning these, Moshe and his father-in-law who may be issued instructions to kill, right? Moshe and his father-in-law's instructions should have no sway with another Jew who knows that there's a commandment not to kill, with any other person, we could say, who knows that there's a moral imperative not to kill. But here, halachically, we're talking about Jews. And so therefore, it's the Jew who actually did the action who is held responsible. But interestingly, right, it's in this case, we have another layer, because apparently it wasn't the Jewish thug who killed Shalom with his own hands. He hired non-Jewish assassins, but he is in fact, according to Chaim, held responsible for the actions of the non-Jews, because they're put into a different category, who are not bound or who are not assumed to follow the law in that regard. Now, we're not going to get into all the ins and outs of that particular aspect of the case, because that at the moment interests me less than this question of the way that Chaim really related to the local justice system and the way that he was encouraging these, again, Jews caught up in violent altercations to really to turn to local authorities if that was a way of breaking the cycle of violence. So I want to now take a look at we're jumping a little bit to the first paragraph on page 3, the one that I have up here. And in all this, I wrote that even if it were so that they, that is Moshe and his father-in-law, told him, meaning the Jewish thug, the villain, to do it, which, by the way, he says, I haven't seen any clear testimony on this at all. Even if that were the case, And it is appropriate to castigate all those who call Reb Moshe and his father-in-law murderers with regards to this whole terrible episode, and so too to clear their names that they did not tell the villain to do it. Again, I have not seen any clear testimony about this either, for who knows what they whispered together when they came out of the Jewish court after they were chased out, and heaven forbid we must not suspect Reb Moshe of this terrible thing. Nonetheless, to ban and excommunicate those who open their mouths against them on this matter without constraint, it is not possible due to the prohibition. Do not place a stumbling block before the blind, for it is clear that they will transgress. And he goes on and on here. Just to unpack this and untangle this, apparently, there were rumors in the community that Moshe and his father-in-law were in fact responsible for Shalom's murder. And they had been branded, at least on the social level, murderers, right? Other Jews in the community were blaming them for Shalom's murder. And interestingly, Chaim comes out against that practice. He says they really should not be held responsible. Even if they asked that, they whispered with that Jewish thug. Apparently there had been some testimony that people had seen them whispering with that Jewish thug who then ultimately brought the non-Jewish assassins. You know, even if that were the case, we still don't have any direct evidence linking them to the murder, and it is inappropriate to defame them by calling them murderers, right? Which is very, very distinct from the way that he treats the Jew who actually did bring the assassins. But what it also adds for us here is it adds another layer of the justice system that was involved, because he seems, and again, it's very hard to piece together all these pieces, but it's clear that Chaim indicates that at some point in time, all of these litigants were in a Jewish court. And so what we have here is we have several layers of justice. I'm going to unpack it in just one moment. I want to take a look at one last little piece here. What Chaim says over here in this last paragraph, indeed, this is my final word, that there is absolutely no murder verdict for Moshe and his father-in-law in this terrible episode, and so it should be proclaimed in my name in any place that they wish. And with regard to the complaints that the relatives of the murdered ones submitted to the non-Jewish authorities, and according to their, that is Moshe and his father-in-law's claims, caused them to lose their money thereby, it seems that they, that is Shalom's relatives, should not be charged for the laws of informing our Knas, and he goes on and on about that, right? So we hear that at another stage of the dispute, Shalom's relatives, right, that is the relatives of the murdered man, actually did take Moshe and his father-in-law into a non-Jewish court, right? Chaim says Moshe and his father-in-law should have taken Shalom and his relatives into a non-Jewish court to stop the cycle of violence. That did not happen, unfortunately. But at some later stage of the altercation, the parties ended up, first of all, in a Jewish court, and then secondarily in a local court in which Shalom and his relatives, again, I mean, sorry, not Shalom, Shalom was dead. The relatives of this murdered Shalom tried to defame Moshe and his father-in-law, right? They dragged them into a non-Jewish court to defame them, and as a result, Moshe and his father-in-law were indeed fined and lost money. And that's another part of the question that was submitted to Chaim, what to do about those fines, who's responsible for those? Again, based on this idea that if Jews drag one another into local courts, they're going to be held responsible for the damages that might be imposed. Okay, there's a lot of layers to this story, and in a short amount of time, it's hard to follow and to keep all the pieces together. A lot of detective work can be done here. Having done some of this detective work in a different context, it seems to me that this responsum can actually be connected with a few other responsa that we have from Chaim and from some other authorities of the time, and that help us piece together a little bit more of the story. But what I'd like to, again, in the bit of time that's left to us today, is to highlight one particular point here, which is that clearly the Jews of the era were turning to a whole array of different legal authorities and legal systems, right? Let's think together for a moment about all of the different authorities we have encountered in this responsum, all of the different either legal systems or legal authorities that we have encountered, that people have turned to, or that people should have turned to, what were the different options for Jews when they had to adjudicate a dispute like this? What are the different, some of the different authorities that we have heard about here?
The Jewish authorities, the non-Jewish authorities?
Both. Let's think about all the different authority, all the different justice, personalities and systems we have encountered. I'll start with an easy one. We have Chaim himself, right? Chaim is the respondent here. He obviously was being consulted as an expert. He's being asked to issue a ruling to adjudicate a certain layer of this dispute, right? So we have the outside expert halachic authority, right? That's Chaim himself. Who else have we heard about here? What did Chaim tell the people that they should have done? Who should they have turned to?
The non-Jewish court.
The local non-Jewish court, meaning clearly he meant the closest, the most accessible local non-Jewish court. Local non-Jewish, he calls him hashofet, judge, right? Someone who is going to step in like a law enforcement authority. Again, we could imagine a police force, but that's not exactly what they had. Someone who's going to step in and stop the violence in its tracks, right? That was another option for, again, justice, law enforcement that was apparently, right, Chaim seems to be clearly assuming that would have been accessible and available to these Jews. What else do we hear about? What other authorities do we hear about here? We just read about a local non-Jewish court that Shalom's relatives actually did turn to in order to defame Moshe and his father-in-law after the whole murder, right? So we hear about that. What else do we hear about? I want to remind you way back at the beginning.
Went to a non-Jewish court, in fact.
Yes, exactly. So again, Shalom's relatives took Moshe and his father-in-law to a non-Jewish court to defame them, right? That's another layer that we hear, another authority that we hear about. I want to remind you way back at the beginning, I kind of glossed over this, but do you remember at the very beginning, Chaim says, right, I'm back at the first opening lines of this responsum, it says, there are wise men in your midst, my teacher, Rabbi Shabtai, son of the Honorable Shmuel, in his court. Right, Chaim here was highlighting for them. Now, again, Chaim is the outside expert that they're consulting way after the fact to kind of, deal with this huge dispute that has cropped up. What he says to them is, you have a local rabbinic court, a local expert, rabbinic expert, who could have helped you here as well. And that's this character, Shabtai ben Shmuel, who, by the way, we know was a recognized authority. And this, by the way, I told you before that I suspect this incident occurred in the area, that peripheral area of Magdeburg. That's because Shabtai ben Shmuel is a character who we know was a halachic authority in the vicinity of Magdeburg at the end of the 13th century. And the fact that Chaim refers to him as the local authority, the local rabbinic authority that they should have turned to at some stage of the case, suggests that this whole incident probably happened in that region. Now, we're clearly here from a historical perspective. We're clearly hearing here. There's a lot of things that we can take away from this case about, first of all, the violence, the amount of violence that there was in Jewish communities of the era, and different ways that Jewish authorities could and really could not contend with the violence. But again, what I really want to highlight here is the way that Jewish authorities, in this case, Chaim, relates to the various layers of the local justice system as a system that can really support the halakha, right? That does not have to be perceived, as it often was, as in conflict with the halakha, but as something that can really support the Jewish community and thereby support the halakha and be supported by himself and other halachic authorities as a legitimate and helpful means of, again, controlling violence, enforcing the law, and ultimately maintaining justice and order within the Jewish communities. And I think that that's pretty far-reaching for a halachic authority, the way the manner in which Chaim speaks about those local authorities. And I want to suggest that it says something about the times in which Chaim was living and his perception of the environment in which he was living. Right? Normally, we often think of Jews in medieval Europe and the medieval German Empire in particular as having been persecuted, beleaguered, and also as having been really as having held themselves apart from the local society, certainly the local justice system, right? That's where these all of these halachic ideas come from. And I think that what we see here is something very different, which to my mind suggests, and again, there are other pieces of other halachic texts that support this, that Chaim really saw himself as being part of a broader trend in his environment, in which law and order really was the motive and the intent of local authorities. That they were not out to get the Jews, that they were not out to disrupt Jewish communal life, but they in fact could be used as an assist in maintaining a positive form of Jewish life, and certainly as keeping violence in check. And in this respect, it seems to me, on top of in conjunction with what we have seen in previous weeks, this is another way in which we can really see that these halachic authorities, as well as the lay people in these communities of medieval Ashkenaz, really saw themselves, despite the distinctiveness of Jewish law and despite the distinctiveness of Jewish communal life, as being embedded in a much broader social order, as well as in a much broader legal culture and legal system. And that's something that, again, I hope that we can pick up on in the weeks that remain to us and try to explain and flesh out a little bit further. I'm going to stop here for now, but if there are any questions, I would be happy to take them.
So I'm wondering, I understand pretty well why the Zarua insists that Rav Moshe and his father-in-law are not murderers, but
Yeah.
he seems to be going much beyond that. He seems to be trying to, or at least it went by quickly, that to prevent people from socially ostracizing them. They were in fact morally quite responsible, even though they're not murderers. They were definitely involved with the causing of the death. And so that to claim that their neighbors shouldn't dislike them and not decide to ask.
Well, he doesn't say not dislike them. He says shouldn't defame them as murderers, shouldn't ostracize them as murderers, right?
Well, they can't impose a nidui, but they could stop dealing with them. I mean, he seems to be going beyond the bounds of the required law.
Yeah, no, that's very striking to me as well. I think it goes hand in hand with his insistence that this, the other Jewish man involved here, this Jewish, again, the guy who I'm calling the thug, the one who actually brought along the assassins, with really pinning the blame and the responsibility on him. That, he really has to be held accountable for this murder, because, he was the one, even if he didn't, do it with his own hands, he was the one who brought in, again, the non-Jewish assassins. That is considered something that that's like, basically having done it himself. He's held responsible for that. And I think in pinning the blame on him, he thereby kind of absolves Moshe. But it's striking to me, as you say, it's striking to me as well. That he does seem to be, sort of clearing their name in a way that we would not necessarily, we would, I also would tend to think that they should be held morally accountable, if not legally accountable for what happened. Yeah. Yes, please, Cheryl, I think you have a question.
I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
The way he signed off, is that a formulaic? I'm caught by the word for. Is that typical? The forlorn word got to me. So
yes, thank you. Thank you for highlighting that. Yes, in Hebrew it's aluv. I translated that as forlorn. it is fairly common among the medieval respondents to be sort of self-denigrating in that kinds of way. Yeah, much as they oftentimes address their correspondence in very flowery and kinds of sometimes over-the-top praise, it is fairly common that they refer to themselves in such a self-deprecating manner. Yeah, thanks for noticing that. Okay.
Okay.
Please, as I said, please do feel free to be in touch with me if more questions occur to you as you process the material or at the beginning of class next week.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank
do
you.
people have your email, Rachel, if they do want to get in touch?
You know what? You are very welcome to put. You have it, Evie, right? You're very welcome to put it into the.
I have
Okay.
it.
Here, you
Do
know what?
wanna
I'll put it
in the
I'll
chat
put it into the
while
chat.
I,
Yeah. I'll put it
Okay,
into the
that
chat very
sounds
quickly
great.
right now.
I had it at one
and I can
point,
do
I'm
it.
sorry.
Sure. No, that's fine. I will be happy to also put it in, to give it to everyone next week as well.
Okay, perfect.
In case anybody misses it right now. But here, I'm going to put it into the chat right now. As I said, if any questions occur to you as you process, you're welcome to be in touch.
Wonderful. Thank you
Okay.
so much, Rachel. Perfect. And the
Thank
email
you.
address is in the chat right now for anyone
Yeah,
who's interested.
exactly.
Thanks again, Rachel, and thank you to all the participants that joined us today, not only here on Zoom, but also on Facebook. Just a reminder that this Thursday at 12:30 p.m. Eastern, we have Rabbi John Kelson, who will be teaching as part of discussions on the parasha. And we'll see you there. And of course, we'll see each other next week in this class as well. Thank you so much. Lehitraot.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Litraot.